Hello and welcome back to Revolutionary Ideas, the monthly podcast of Marxism from Socialist Alternative. One central issue for socialists is the oppression of women. From the very earliest class societies, women's oppression has been central to oppression in other areas of life, including in the workplace. But how is that the case? Why is that? And what can socialists, workers, trade union activists do to challenge this? Last week, we talked about the Marxist view of women's oppression and how we should understand it in terms of its roots in class society and its roots in class exploitation. The episode ended with a discussion on Friedrich Engels' Marxist classic, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, which the panel refers to at the start of this panel discussion. Now we will cover the record of the Bolsheviks and the record of past socialist organisations and socialist movements, and uncover the real record of our organisation, International Socialist Alternative, in fighting for real gains for women through methods of mass struggle. Like last week, Yara will be interviewing Sarah Wrack from Socialist Alternative's Political Committee, and also Katia Hancke from Socialist Alternative's sister organisation in Ireland, the Socialist Party, and she's also an activist with Rosa, the Socialist Feminist campaign.
So I think that kind of leads me to another question that I have about not just this book, but the impact it had on the real world, So I was wondering, first of all, what was kind of the impact that it had when it came out? And also, obviously, a few decades later, we've started seeing a lot of revolutions going around the world, and especially, I think, the Russian Revolution, that's obviously incredibly significant and the historical sense of the working class, but also of women. It really changed the position of women, and also, started from a women's struggle. So I was wondering, what do you think about that, and how do you think those two connect?
I think they're very closely connected, and it's another aspect of the book that makes it so interesting. So this book was written in 1884. Just a few years before that, in 1879, Bebel had published his book, Women and Socialism. So there was clearly an interest within the socialist movement to come to grips with women's oppression and how it was linked to capitalism, to class society. But it wasn't just left at like a theoretical understanding and now we're happy, look, we know where it's coming from, It was also taken up, especially by the revolutionary left within the Second International, as a real tool to start organizing women who for the first time were drawn in massive numbers into the workforce. And you get people like Clara Zetkin, who, spent their life within the socialist movement, really going out in very creative ways to bring women workers into the socialist movement, to get women workers organized in trade unions, and to assist women to get politically active in this period of enormous change for women workers in particular, who for the first time find themselves, outside of the home, working in this huge socialized environment, participating in strikes, and often starting to become the most radicalized section of workers. For in many ways, still the same reasons are there today, because women were lower paid than men, they were more exploited than men. They were also carrying this double burden of all the domestic tasks that were facing them. And in the 19th century, no washing machines, no dishwashers. This was a whole lot worse again, no childcare. And you see this massive radicalization of women, first in the 1890s through a strike wave, but then especially with the First World War, where even more women internationally are drawn into the workforce. And women really come to the fore in worker struggles right across the world, particularly in Russia, actually.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point about like this period of kind of revolutionary history, that both that revolutionaries recognized the importance of organising, turning to women workers who, like Katia said, there was this big influx into the workforce, that if you were going to be successfully organising workers, you had to pay special attention to women workers, and that was it wasn't just this is important, but that they were active in that there were really revolutionary in all senses of the word initiatives taken, and particularly driven by some women revolutionaries like Katia mentioned, Clara Zetkin, who, as you can imagine, will have had to fight against some resistance to those kind of initiatives, but did fight and had really successful impact, as was kind of most demonstrated, I think, in the Russian Revolution and what came afterwards.
It's really interesting to trace that activism of female revolutionaries and how it actually correlates with the debates that were happening within the socialist movement at the time between reformists and revolutionaries, because it's the reformists who are arguing against organizing women, generally speaking, and who look at women as the most backward section of the working class. They're too difficult to organize. They actually undermine the wages of men. And what we need to do, therefore, is force women back into the home, where revolutionaries say the opposite, right? And I think that does link back to that very central concept that Marx and Engels, from the Communist Manifesto all the way through, pushed, of the importance of self-emancipation. So yes, Engels analyzes the root causes of women's oppression, but then revolutionaries all the way through combine that with the idea of the only people who can fight women's oppression are first and foremost women workers themselves, coming to the fore and leading that struggle, and then in that struggle building solidarity and common cause with other workers. But it's absolutely crucial that women are central in fighting their own oppression, and therefore the logical conclusion is that you're going to try and organize women workers, and that you're going to assist women in special initiatives to get politically active and to overcome the double burden that they are suffering from in terms of exploitation and oppression. And you see that in the initiatives that are taken in Germany, but you see it also in the initiatives that are taken by the Bolshevik Party from 1914 onwards, consciously targeting female sectors of the economy, the big textile industry and so on, but also community initiatives of trying to assist women to become politically active, to join their party, and to actually play a real role in the political struggle that was developing so quickly in that period.
Yes, and I completely agree with that. And I also think that the impact of that showed, women being organized led to this revolution to actually happen. That's what started the revolutionary period in Russia at the time. A struggle of textile workers. And I think that it's incredibly important, but it's also incredibly important to see that women didn't just organize before and were radicalized by that double burden that they had. And it's not just that they kind of led the revolution, which is something I think that is not talked about enough in history. We keep hearing about those prominent male figures, as much as they were great and, an inspiration, and also had really progressive positions about women's oppression too. I think it's not just Marx and Engels that wrote massively about how important, how much the oppression of women is at the core of class society and the capitalist system. It was also Trotsky, it was also Lenin who were talking about this a lot. But it wasn't just the role of women in the revolution or in the pre-revolutionary period. It's also the role of women after the revolution in creating the society, and also in bringing out those rights and those victories into the women's movement. So I was wondering if we can talk a little bit about the position of women and how it's changed after the revolution as well.
All those things are linked, aren't they? Because if you get more women workers being central to the struggle, they're also going to feel more confident to bring their own experience of women's oppression and the issues that are associated with that to the heart of the struggle and to the heart of the changes that are being made in the course of the revolution and immediately after the revolution. And it's incredibly inspiring to look at what the Bolsheviks achieved within years of after the 1917 Russian Revolution. And maybe just to give a few examples, because I think many people on the left would be vaguely aware of the kind of legal changes that were brought in 1918, 1919. They made abortion legal. LGBT people were no longer in any way legally oppressed. They made divorce possible. They also gave women proper maternity care and proper legal rights to maternity leave and so on and so forth, and many, many other examples. But I think what is even more interesting to discuss is that they only saw that as a starting point. They saw that as like the very bare minimum that had to just, get that out of the way, at least legally, all that is sorted, equal pay and so on. But now we need to start a real fight of actually dealing with the hundreds of years of ideological oppression that has accompanied the oppression of women. The extremely patriarchal, backward society that Russia still was in 1917, and how do you challenge all that? So they set up this women's organization, Genotel, which was meant to assist women to realize the newfound rights that they had been given, but also to assist women to become more politically active, more involved in this new state, and get more of a stake and a say in how things could be organized and so on. So you get, on an economic level, the setting up of canteens, childcare facilities, literacy circles, because illiteracy was still a massive deal and so on. But you also get specific schemes where they take women workers and give them internships into parts of the state apparatus. So the organizing of new departments, women workers are brought into them to feed in their own experience in terms of what they think would work best, but also to learn new skills in terms of administration and so on and so forth, which they then at the end of their 1-year internship can take back to the area where they live and in their own community implement and so on and so forth. And you're talking about a program on a massive scale. Krupskaya talks in the early 1930s of the fact that probably nearly 10 million people were delegates, were part of this intern scheme, So there was an enormous impetus after the revolution to fight oppression in every way possible, legally, economically, but also socially, ideologically, psychologically, and even sexually, in terms of the enormous outbursts of sexual liberation amongst the new generation of people who realized all these newfound freedoms were actually possible now.
Yeah, I always think that you have to kind of step back and think about when this was 1917 and the position facing women in most of the world at that time, and just how much revolutionary progress was made for women in such a short space of time. And I think I agree with what you're saying, Katia, that kind of the most interesting thing about it in a sense, is, yes, the legal advances were excellent and essential, and all the communal laundries and canteens and everything made a huge difference, no doubt. But the kind of the realization that none of those things would change overnight the experience of ordinary women on the ground, and they wouldn't change overnight the attitudes that existed, including amongst working class, including amongst revolutionaries, in fact, because as we kind of discussed, those things are very deeply embedded within the kind of very nature of society. And so taking a conscious approach to continuing, even once you've changed, you've carried out this major transformation of society, to continuing a conscious approach to try to in every way tackle those attitudes and to really work on the striving for the maximum involvement of women at every level of society, and that's something that was really taken very seriously by the Bolsheviks at every stage. And actually, I was just reading about the 1905 revolution, which is kind of the precursor to 1917, practice run, if you like. That in that there was a very small proportion of members of the Bolshevik Party were women, but a much higher than that proportion of their delegates to the Soviet were women. So they, from that early stage, kind of disproportionately, we need to make sure that women are playing more than a proportionate role in the revolutionary process to try and overcome the situation that they're facing. And I think, that all of those initiatives that Katia referenced are, really inspirational even today, let alone when you think about the time that they were kind of working in.
Yeah, I really agree with it. And I think that also, even today, obviously we still live under a capitalist system, but even today, like it's a conscious effort that we're trying to make in not just radicalizing women, but also giving women positions of leadership and also involving them in every stage of kind of like political activity. And we still see that even today, these perceptions and these kind of power relations are so entrenched in society, they're so endemic to the system that they're not going to go away in one day. You can change legality in one day, and that was done, but you can't change, first of all, the internalized sexism the women have. And we see that in everywhere. In the classroom, we see that women are less likely to speak, even though women are still are now legally allowed to go to university, and women in some countries like in Britain have a higher percentage in universities. They're still less in kind of in positions of power. They still even speak less in lectures. And I think that's something that is not going to go away the day after the revolution. It's something that needs to be consciously dealt with. And if we're talking about today, I also wanted to kind of bring the conversation to the last few decades, or even the last decade, that I think has seen massive progress in terms of women going out, fighting and struggling against the system and against women's oppression. We've had, at the beginning of the last decade, we had this massive slut walk movement that became international, and was kind of feeding off the kind of revolutionary wave that was happening at the time, without the connection to women's oppression. But then, as the decade progressed, we've also seen, we mentioned the Me Too movement a little bit before, but we've seen this movement that's genuinely started changing so much about the way that we kind of talk about the position of women in society, but also brought some, tangible changes, even if not enough. So I was wondering, first of all, do you think that these movements kind of signify a change within the capitalist system, or do you think that socialism is still relevant?
Well, firstly, I think that the movements that have taken place in the last decade have been some of the most inspirational that have taken place in that decade. Yari mentioned a whole number of them, the movements against violence against women in Latin America, for abortion rights in Poland and Ireland, which I think Katia should speak about. I think they have kind of inspired particularly a generation of young people to be interested in changing society in a general way, as well as starting from the specific issue of the oppression of women. And they've been movements that are very determined, very radical, that have instinctive internationalism, that are linking up between the movements in different places, which is really significant, but also have a very kind of fundamental questioning of the way, have led to a very fundamental questioning of the way that society is, and recognition that it doesn't have to be like that. I think if you look at, on a whole number of different factors, the attitudes of young people now compared to young people 15 years ago, for example, there's been some really huge transformations in attitudes towards gender and a whole number of other things. And so Socialist Alternative in Britain and International Socialist Alternative around the world have been really participating in all these movements because they're so important. And what one of the things that we raise in them all is how can they win? That's the question for us. Is inspirational movements are just that, they're inspirational, but the question is how can they achieve real change? And I think for that we do have to go back to kind of what we've discussed earlier in the discussion of the fundamental fact remains that the oppression of women, and in all its forms, is inherently linked to the capitalist system. And so for these movements to have significant and lasting effects, which I think is what the majority of people involved in them are wanting to win, then they need to be challenging capitalism and trying to link the immediate demands that they're raising to the need to transform society fundamentally in order to change that oppression.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think the what you mentioned about kind of the abortion rights fight in Ireland is a really good example, because it was a victory. But even after that victory, within the confines of capitalism, it's still something that's always going to be threatened by the capitalist establishment, and it's always going to be, you know, something that when we're not looking might be taken away. And I was wondering, Katia, can you tell us a little bit about your involvement in that campaign and what was done and how this campaign succeeded?
I think that campaign is maybe actually a really good example of how the points that Sarah made in a general way actually also very practically have an impact on the tactics and strategy and your thinking around how you can win a campaign. Because I think as socialist feminists, we were completely invested in making sure that we won abortion rights here in Ireland. But we certainly had differences with other feminists here about how it could be done. And I think one of the key things that made us stand out from other groups was that we had way more confidence in the willingness of ordinary people, of working class people, to have moved way beyond what was the conventional wisdom of what was acceptable and isn't acceptable in Ireland. You know, this kind of leprechaun green version of what Irish people are supposed to be, where we actually said, like, look, there's been a massive change for in particular women since the 90s in terms of their living conditions, every aspect of their lives, and for working people in general. And they've moved way beyond this control that would have been there maybe a generation ago of the Catholic Church. People's attitudes around sexuality and around abortion are way ahead of where the establishment are. So conclusion for us was, we base ourselves on ordinary people, we base ourselves on working class people to push this change through against the wishes of the establishment, which are much more conservative, where many of the traditional feminists, bourgeois feminists here in Ireland, would have been very focused on step-by-step, gently, slowly, convincing the establishment that change is needed, because that's where the change is going to come. We always said change comes from below. Change comes from mobilizing all those people who see that change is needed to become active around that change. And actually, the repeal movement was just that. It was a massive outburst from below, especially led by a young generation, a new generation coming out onto the streets, organizing demonstrations, organizing strikes, but also taking radical action in terms of openly defying the law, making abortion pills available and turning them into a political weapon, saying, like, no longer is there just the escape valve of Irish people having to travel mainly to England in secret to get an abortion. Abortion is happening here on this island right now. We're breaking the law right in front of you. And what are you going to do about it? And really pushing those boundaries out and forcing the establishment to a confrontation of either you're going to actually start locking up young working class women fighting for their rights because of an antiquated law that is being broken every day anyway, or you're actually being forced to go with the change. And reluctantly, that's what the establishment did. And God, did they struggle with adjusting to it. But because of the tactics we used of really pushing abortion happening in Ireland to the forefront, we didn't just win very limited abortion rights. We actually won quite good legislation in terms of abortion on demand up to 12 weeks. And then a whole rake of nuances and details after that. But abortion is available. But you're also right. I mean, does that mean we've won abortion forever after? No. Our view always was we wanted to win not just legal change. We wanted to make sure that actually abortion is available for working class women through the public health service and not some kind of privilege that only those who can pay can afford. For the moment, that is the case. But that's with a big but, because a lot of the hospitals are still owned by the Catholic Church, and therefore the board of management is still influenced by those antiquated ideas. And there's still continuously a threat of a pulling back of abortion provision in hospitals, in regions of the country, and so on and so forth. So it's an ongoing fight, because if they could, they would roll it back tomorrow. But it's only because of this massive change from below, because of this activating of working class people, because of a younger generation of working class people talking to their parents and winning them over to also get active around this, that we're actually, for the moment, still have access to what should be a universal right.
Yeah, and I think that's, the key point of all of it, of all of what we've been talking about today, that like, if the capitalist system is benefiting from the oppression of women, if the capitalist system is benefiting from opposition as, oppressed, then they're not going to just give us the freedom that we need. They're not just going to liberate us. I mean, even if they wanted to, and they don't, they wouldn't be able to liberate women completely because of the reliance of the system on the oppression of women. But even those, victories of some aspects of liberation are not going to just be given to us. And even if we win them, we'll still need to fight to maintain them. And I think in the last few years, especially, we've seen some movements use tactics that maybe people before have kind of deemed old-fashioned or old world, or something that no one's going to ever do again, like strikes. And I was wondering, what do we think about those tactics of striking, joining unions? What is the role of the unions in fighting for women's liberation?
Yeah, I think that it's a really interesting thing that many of these movements in different countries have turned back to the method of strike, like you say, but in general, the methods of mass struggle. Because, prior to the last decade, there was kind of a prevailing idea that the time for mass struggle was over, and the way now for women to win liberation was mainly through individual action and through, individual women standing up against discrimination, maybe getting into boardrooms, becoming elected politicians, those kind of things, which maybe is a whole other discussion about whether that actually benefits working class women in any way. But I think, that is a really positive turn from our point of view, that there is, I think, an instinctive understanding amongst this generation of feminists that there is a need for the mass participation of people of all genders, in fact, in the fight against the oppression of women, and that's really positive. I suppose the issue of the trade unions, which would be maybe kind of the traditional bodies who have used the tactic of the strike, is an interesting one and slightly different, because I think the first thing to say is that in general, on an international scale, the trade unions have not played the role that they should have done in these movements, that they've kind of stood back and not seen the significance of the anger that exists on these issues and the struggle that's taking place. But I think that is not necessarily a lasting fact. That's related to all kinds of problems that exist within the trade unions and failures of leadership, a shift to the right in those unions, which maybe should form a podcast within itself. But the point for us is that what the trade unions represent is the organisation within the workplace of the working class. And because of everything we've discussed earlier in this discussion, we see the working class as being the force within society that has the potential power to bring about change.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly inspiring to see how feminist movements over the last 10 years have developed and the strategies and tactics they're adopting. I think that aspect of instinctual international solidarity is incredibly inspiring, and it really, it's not just feminist struggles where you can see that the environmental movement, many other movements also have that same kind of characteristic. But for instance, I know that here in Ireland, the struggle for abortion rights was directly inspired by some of the tactics used in Poland. And the idea of a women's strike, which was tried out first in Poland, was adapted and implemented in Ireland into a strike full stop, which wasn't exclusively for women. And then that inspired actions in Argentina directly, So you can see how this movement truly is international in terms of drawing lessons from fellow struggles across the world. And that's a really, really positive thing, I think. It also points towards this innate instinct for the need to get organized amongst working people. And I think the idea of getting organized, to be able to organize a strike and so on, obviously poses the question of unionization, of workplace organization in some kinds. And traditionally, that would be through the trade unions. And really, certainly in Ireland, it's been a pity that the trade unions haven't engaged themselves in that struggle so far. And I think they missed out on an opportunity to organize a new generation of workers who are mainly working in non-unionized sectors, in very precarious jobs and so on and so forth. But if you look at the broader developments that are happening, the idea that people are starting to use strikes, that people see the centrality of workplace struggles in terms of fighting on a whole range of issues, not just purely economic struggles related to the workplace, but also political issues, broader issues of oppression and so on and so forth. That does point to a rejuvenation of union struggles. And you can actually see some of that happening in the US in terms of teacher strikes and so on, where, once again, being unionized is given a new meaning, a much more radical meaning, a much more relevancy. And I think that's really important for us to register and to be in and around. Last weekend in Belgium, health workers went out on the street, got massive solidarity from other sectors of the economy, and again, kind of used their workplace power to highlight a whole number of issues, including the low pay in the sector, because it's a overwhelmingly female sector, and linking those issues of oppression with the need for solidarity amongst working class people and the need to organize in their workplaces.
Yeah, I think those are really, really good points. And especially I think the point that you've made about how those struggles around the world are inspiring one another. And I think that is kind of like a central point of what Marxists have been saying for like over 100 years now, that kind of the system is a global system. And the fight against it has to be international, and it's not just in in terms of solidarity. It's not just in terms of learning from one another, but it's also in terms of fighting together and organizing together on a national but also international level to fight those international issues. And I think that is a great and inspiring point to finish on. I think this has been really, really interesting. I think both hearing about the history and the theory behind the oppression of women, but also how we're going to fight it, and why is, like I think Sarah said, well, what's the most effective way to actually win the liberation of women, which I think we managed to touch on, even though we might not have had the time to draw out a full program. But if the listeners want to learn more about what we think is the way to go forward with the struggle, and of course read more about our analysis of women's oppression and the way to fight it, then please go to our website. It's going to be linked in the description. And of course, join us. If you're in England, Wales, and Scotland, you can always go to our website and register there. Or, of course, go to the internationalsocialist.net website and register there too if you're out of England, Wales, and Scotland. So it was great talking to you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Katia. And thank you for everyone listening. See you next month.
If you like what you've heard in this episode, I want to urge you to get in contact with Socialist Alternative today. Go to socialistalternative.net, where we have information on various upcoming events, different news stories, our analysis on what's happening around the world, and information on how you can get in touch and take part in the fight for socialism. Go to our Facebook page, which is Socialist Alternative ISA England, Wales and Scotland. For our Instagram, go to socialistalternative.ews. For TikTok, it's socialist_vids. And finally for Twitter, it's socialist alt EWS.